Welcome to the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series hosted by the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. As we get started, we would like to acknowledge and to honor the Mi'kmaq, Lenape, Batawadmik, and Sawanwa people as past, present, and future caretakers of the lands on which Indiana University Bloomington is located. These ancestral indigenous homelands and resources are the current home of the Environmental Resilience Institute. We encourage everyone to engage with contemporary communities, to learn the histories of this land, to look at who has and does not have access to its resources, and to examine your own place, abilities, and obligations within this process of reparative work. Our webinar today will focus on addressing community climate vulnerabilities, specifically within the energy sector. Additionally, we will discuss the importance of integrating equity within vulnerability plans. All webinar attendees are muted. Please enter your questions into the chat function, which you can access by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window. In the last few minutes of the webinar, we will share a feedback survey through a Zoom poll, and we'd appreciate your responses before you sign off today. We are recording today's webinar, and we will share a link to that recording along with follow-up resources with all registrants early next week so that you can share what you've learned with your colleagues. And now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Gabe Filippelli, the Executive Director of IU's Environmental Resilience Institute.
Well, thanks, Steve, for kicking us off, and welcome everybody to this month's webinar. Really exciting topic. As you can imagine, resilience and vulnerability is what the Environmental Resilience Institute is all about. Really, to enhance the resilience of communities, local governments really need to fully understand and address the specific climate vulnerabilities that impact their communities. Through climate vulnerability planning, local governments can actually ensure that vulnerable populations have the necessary resources to mitigate and adapt to climate change and environmental degradation. And I was thrilled to see that the climate resilience aspects of the infrastructure bill remained in this first bill that was passed and is soon to be signed. It has a sizable proportion of money for climate resilience here in the US. We're particularly excited to have our speakers today, to have Deslatte, whom you may have recognized from a previous ERI webinar. Through his work and research, he's been actively involved with addressing community climate vulnerability in local governments. And then our second speaker, who will be Kayley Barrios Lain from the city of Ames, Iowa, who will be discussing that city's climate vulnerability plan, which she helped to develop. This webinar series is coordinated by the Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. In addition to our webinar series, the ERI has many other resources available to local governments and the general public. One resource that I really want to make sure you all know about is our Hoosier Resilience Index, or the HRI. It provides a readiness assessment to help local governments evaluate their community's preparedness for climate risks and identify and prioritize next steps and actions to increase community readiness, very much in line with today's topic. Upon completion of this assessment, the Environmental Resilience Institute will provide 3 readiness scores for your community or organization: extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and floodplain land use. These scores will help provide and inform you about how you can go about the next steps in terms of making yourself more ready. So if we can get the next slide. Yes, the upcoming webinar, we hope you join us for next month's webinar, which will focus on restoring degraded waterways to improve essential ecological functions, such as providing clean water, supporting biodiversity, and of course, mitigating floods and droughts. And we hope you will encourage your friends and colleagues to join as well. We, of course, want to thank our co-hosts who support this webinar. Including Accelerate Municipal Indiana Municipalities, or AIM, as well as Health by Design, and ACE, the Association of Indiana Counties, and of course the Indiana Public Health Association. Our presenters, joining us today are, as you can see, a host of organizations, including state and local governments and other organizations, and of course a lot of the Friends of ERI. So our presenters today We'll include, as I mentioned, Dr. Aaron Deslatte, who joined O'Neill School here at IU Bloomington as an associate professor in 2019. And he directs the Metropolitan Governance and Management Transitions Laboratory. His research focuses on the roles that public managers play in enhancing economic, environmental, and social vulnerability at the local and metropolitan level, really with the goal of building cumulative knowledge which can help local governments advance sustainable economic and community development. And following Aaron will be Kayley Barrios Lain. She is the Energy Services Coordinator with the City of Ames, Iowa. She manages projects for the municipally owned electric utility, including a community solar farm, district utility geothermal offerings, and electric vehicle charger installations. She's very involved in the city's climate action planning process, exploring ways to advance energy efficiency, renewable energy, electricity grid resilience, equity in utility offerings, beneficial electrification, and electricity demand response. So the speaking order will be Dr. Aaron Deslatte, who will pass it off to Kayley Barrios Lain. Remember, you can enter questions through the chat function, and that's the preferable way, and we'll moderate some of those questions at the end. Or you can unmute yourself at the very end and ask a question. Both options will appear in your control bars when you hover your mouse over the Zoom window. So without further ado, Aaron, please kick us off.
Great, thank you. All right, you can see and hear me, correct?
You bet.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. It's an honor to be here again presenting for the ERI audience. What I'm going to do is kind of give a very broad overview of climate vulnerability and sort of assessing the landscape, and show you one quick research application where we look at the impact of social vulnerability on local economic development resource allocation. So it's important to start with some definitions. Social vulnerability, of course, is a concept that has been around for a very long time and is generally defined as the identification of sensitive populations that may be less likely to respond to, cope with, or recover from a natural disaster. This, of course, is a term utilized in sort of risk management and disaster preparation. In terms of climate vulnerability, this is a closely related concept, and it was defined for us by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a few assessments ago, where they define climate vulnerability as the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So one of the important sort of additions with this definitional clarity is that we're talking about a product of systems. And so this vulnerability definition can or metric can vary based off a combination of factors and interactions between these factors, such as socioeconomic status, race, gender identification, age, physical ability, and urban development patterns. And it's important to note when we talk about climate vulnerability or community vulnerability more broadly, that we're not implying that these factors make an individual more inherently vulnerable. Rather, this categorization of vulnerability as a product of a system means that we're measuring system deficiencies, system failures, and or patterns of discrimination and disinvestment that occur. So here's a way to visualize vulnerability. We see from a systems perspective that we have feedbacks between climate patterns and socioeconomic processes. And we see climatic change, whether that's from natural variability or more frequently anthropogenic climate change, increasing the likelihood of hazards. So forcing increased hazards. Then we have from the socioeconomic processes that can play out an increased forcing on exposures of specific populations and thereby increasing their vulnerability. So this is sort of a feedback loop whereby as hazards increase, exposures increase, and thereby vulnerabilities increase, but these don't increase uniformly across all populations, right? They increase disproportionately in more at-risk or vulnerable populations. And so that's the key sort of takeaway, that vulnerability is our ability to identify who is most at risk. So this is a very large topic that has drawn a lot of attention from the IPCC itself. There's an entire working group, the Working Group 2, that studies impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And their most recent report, which is part of the 6th assessment cycle, is due out in spring of 2022. It had originally been planned to come out a little bit earlier, but COVID has sort of pushed back the timelines. The reason why this an entire sort of working group is focused on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability is because of the increasing or extreme variation in terms of who is impacted and how the impacts vary across time and space. And again, are impacted or exacerbated by a lot of these different socioeconomic, social, or geographic factors. So here's the typical kind of go-to way that we measure social vulnerability. It's an index that was developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and it is a social vulnerability index, and it is a tool that is widely available. It's available to everyone, so you can calculate at the county level or at the census tract level a metric that gives you a snapshot of overall vulnerability, and you can do this from different intervals of time, from 2000 up until about 2018 or so. This will be updated again. I believe next year is when we might have new social vulnerability data that is available through this index. The overall vulnerability score, though, is determined by 4 interdependent or underlying themes, and so you'll notice here that several variables that make up a measurement of socioeconomic status impact vulnerability, several variables that impact household composition and disability impact vulnerability, several variables here that impact or that capture minority status and language factor into the overall vulnerability score. And then lastly, we have several variables that capture housing type and transportation related factors. Those also are fed into this overall measure of vulnerability. So when we talk about vulnerability, there are more than a dozen different variables or measures that are used to calculate a sense of the vulnerability of a community. Vulnerability also does not respect jurisdictional boundaries. This is a map using the SVI of the Chicago Metropolitan Statistical Area. And we see vulnerability clustering in some areas of the city, for example, in the southern and western sides of Chicago. But we also see clustering in suburbs. We see clustering in exurbs. We see clustering in Northwest Indiana through East Chicago and Gary. And we see pockets of social vulnerability that are out in the exurbs of the city. So one of the things that we've found out in researching the impact of governmental fragmentation, or how many different municipalities are present in a given metro area, we found that greater fragmentation actually tends to increase the clustering of social vulnerability. In other words, there's a relationship, there's an association between how fragmented the metropolitan area is and how much tightly clustering of vulnerability we can see. So it's not just a phenomenon that is concentrated in a central city in a metropolitan area. It's really dispersed and not in a uniform way. This is one of the tools that Gabe already mentioned, stole a little bit of my thunder, but this is the Hoosier Resilience Index. And what this does is allow you to take some of this social vulnerability data and actually look at, and this is one of the real values of having that data and having that metric, look at how more vulnerable populations are going to be impacted. And so you can parse this based on the medium emission scenario for extreme heat events, the medium emission scenario for extreme precipitation events, and then of course, how much development has occurred within floodplains. This is some of the work my research lab is doing. We're trying to sort of parse out individual cities in Indiana and what their social vulnerability is, sort of aggregated at the county level, but then how that correlates with the extreme heat days and the forecasted increase that we're going to see there, as well as the extreme precipitation increases. And so you can see, in this case, this is just a snapshot of 5 cities, Bloomington, Gary, Indianapolis, Richmond, and South Bend. You can see there is variation in terms of what the forecast suggests, or the scenario for the increases in extreme heat days. So Bloomington has sort of the highest sort of range of increased medium emission scenarios. They're not the most highly ranked in terms of the county level vulnerability score, though. In fact, we see that Marion County, which is Indianapolis, has the highest vulnerability score, but they are similarly going to be expected to be impacted by increased precipitation and increased extreme heat days. So that's aggregated at the county level. But it's important to note that when we look at the different components of the SVI, we see that this ranking varies. So, for example, in looking at the purple table here at the bottom, socioeconomic vulnerability, we see Indianapolis ranked higher than these other 4 communities. In fact, they are 12th out of 92 in the state of Indiana. But if we look at household composition and disability, we see Wayne County ranked the highest amongst these 4, 6th out of 92, and that's where Richmond, Indiana is. And if we move over here to housing type and transportation, we see Bloomington, or Monroe County, ranked the highest in terms of vulnerability, and that's a function of the high proportion of renters that are in the city and in the county. So the point here is that there's value in the overall metric of vulnerability, but there's also value in taking it apart and looking at how areas compare based on these underlying themes, right? So let's look at a real world kind of application of this, and I won't spend too much time on this because we're going to get a professional right afterwards also talking about a social vulnerability assessment. But this is the Thrive Indianapolis Resilience and Sustainability Plan, which was developed and released in 2019. The city is in the midst of implementing this plan right now. And one of the things Indianapolis did was to conduct a social vulnerability assessment. Here we see the city of Indianapolis, and the pink areas are census tract, combinations of census tract areas where the social vulnerability is highest. So we see it kind of concentrated on the near west side, on the near east side, kind of an area in the near south side and south of Fountain Square, and then a little bit kind of beyond the Beltway. And what that allows Indianapolis to do now is to also overlay where they are forecasting or where they're observing rather maximum daily temperatures in the summertime. And we see just visually a correlation between some of the areas with high social vulnerability and some of the highest maximum daily temperatures in the summertime. On the right here, we can also look at where there are areas of the city that have the highest vulnerability compared to the percent tree cover by block group. And we'll also note that there are numerous areas of high vulnerability with the lowest percent of tree cover. Something else that they do is to overlay vulnerability with impervious surface areas. And then lastly, where floodplains are and the population of below poverty that lives within a floodplain, and they're able to estimate that 166,000 or so of the population of the city are below 200,000, below 200% of the federal poverty level and live within a 1 in 100 year flooding event zone. So these are all different ways that you can illustrate not just where social vulnerability is concentrated, but the risks that these areas are going to absorb or are expected to absorb in the future. So that's sort of an application of how the vulnerability can be used. One of the things I'm interested in, and sort of myself and my other colleagues are researching, is how vulnerability impacts actual resource allocations. And so this is some results from a working paper where we look at vulnerability and equitable economic development. And we're trying to analyze basically how social vulnerability influences local government economic development policies and investment. And there's a lot of multicolored dots here, so I'll try to make some sense of this for you. It's basically not a great picture. We find that over the study period from 1999 through 2014, out of about 3,000 cities that we looked at, social need does not appear to drive economic development activities. And in fact, where we capture social need disparity, so in that case, we're looking at the concentrations of social need within the city, we find that greater concentration actually reduces the probability that these cities are going to engage in job training, engage in community development loans, or to support community development corporation activities in these areas. And so if we think about all the various ways we can try to address social vulnerability or climate vulnerability in communities, economic development is obviously one of the methods that we can do that, besides just making changes to physical infrastructure. And in this sense, the picture, from again 1999 to 2014 is not really positive, right? It doesn't appear that social vulnerability or social need, as we call it in this paper, is really driving either the policies or investment strategies. And this pattern actually does hold up even when we specifically look at how much they are spending on community development. So community development, the Community Development Block Grant Program allows for cities to devote resources to 50 roughly different types of development activities. And we break these activities down into whether they are redistributive or developmental. And we find that even when we are looking at or controlling for actual city expenditures on community development across these two different categories, social needs still does not play a factor. And in fact, you're still going to see cities devoting less attention or resources to the community development, job training, and support for community development corporations. So there's clearly a disconnect here between the economic development strategies historically in cities and these concepts of recognitional and distributional equity, where resources need to be rerouted or redirected toward areas that are more critically in need. I want to end with a positive note that Gabe also mentioned. There's never been a better time right now to try to get a map, to get some better sense of a community's own social vulnerability, because of how much money, how much funding is packed into this infrastructure bill, specifically targeted at resilience and the ability to address some of these vulnerability sort of topics. And I wanted to just highlight a few of these before I pass the mic here. The first is promoting resilient operations for transformative, efficient, and cost-saving transportation, or PROTECT grant program. This is $7.3 billion in formula and $1.4 billion in competitive grants. And this is for resilience-related transportation investments. There is a $500 million for Healthy Streets program. And this is a program that provides grants for eligible entities to deploy cool pavements and porous pavements and to expand tree cover. There's $500 million for Reconnecting Communities pilot program. This is a pilot to try to undo some of the negative impacts of the urban renewal that we saw in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that broke apart communities and further segregated cities. So this is an attempt to sort of reconnect some of these communities that have been disconnected by our interstate systems and our transportation systems. And then we have specific resiliency dollars targeted for building resilient infrastructure communities, or BRIC program. This is $1 billion over 5 years for building resilient infrastructure communities program, which supports pre-disaster and hazard mitigation activities undertaken by states, U.S. territories, tribal governments, and local communities. There is flood mitigation assistance to the tune of $3.5 billion. And I would like to point out that there are roughly 20 or so block grant style programs just within this infrastructure bill that are going to require local governments to compete at some level. So they're going to require you to develop grants, and they're going to require local governments to demonstrate need in order to draw down these dollars. So this is an area that is prime for cities to further develop or dive into assessing their own social vulnerability and their own social needs as a means to justify and go after some of these dollars. So I will pass the mic now. That is all I've got. Thank you very much.
Okay, I am going to share my screen now. Okay, I was introduced, and my name is Kayley Barrios Lain. I'm the Energy Services Coordinator with the City of Ames, Iowa. Thank you, Dr. Deslatte, for that overview of climate vulnerability and community vulnerability. That is very in line with what we have found in our community. So I'll see if I can advance my slide. I'll just quickly, confirm that we found the same things to be true in our community, that we're looking at some of the similar vulnerabilities of more cooling degree days, more extremely hot days, more flooding, and more drought within our community. So as we went through our climate vulnerability study, we were not necessarily surprised by a lot of those findings, but definitely it threw a light on some of the areas that we need to focus on to protect, especially the most vulnerable communities, sub-communities, and populations within our city. And those groups of people, again, as Dr. Deslatte had mentioned, ended up being lots of the elderly, children, low income, minority. We have some English speaking limitations, and a lot of the causes for those sensitivity were also mentioned: extreme weather, air quality, flood, power failure, food insecurity. And so I'm going to jump right into some of the areas that we are acting in now. So this is a diagram that I've actually pulled from an Indiana University publication about climate vulnerability. And these are some of the areas that we feel some of our projects are already addressing. We just finished our climate vulnerability assessment last year, and we're currently in the middle of our climate action plan. So we're working on putting this all together in a cohesive, comprehensive plan. But we do have some projects that have already been overlapping with climate vulnerability. So those are the ones that I want to share with you today. And these are the areas that we see those projects affecting the most. In the government assistance, LIHEAP funds, and weatherization assistance program funds, those are areas that we as a municipal electric utility can support as well, with rebates and with public education, sending people to those programs if they qualify. Energy dependence, of course, as the municipal electric utility for the city of Ames, we have a lot of control and responsibility over this area of climate vulnerability. So we're very much responsible for the price of electricity and maintaining the price of electricity as an affordable energy source within the city of Ames. And there are a lot of different ways that we can do that. So the first chunk of climate vulnerability projects that I want to talk about are these that we see kind of as our new normal. So these are things that affect people all the time, year round, affect everyone, but particularly affect those vulnerable groups more catastrophically sometimes, or they have a bigger impact on those groups. But these are things that we see every day throughout the year in this new normal as our climate changes. So one of the things that we would like to do to support people in this category are make their appliances and facilities more efficient. Several applications of that would be electric vehicles, heat pumps for water and space heating, induction stoves, weatherization, and passive solar design. These are all ways that we can make existing facilities or new purchases, when people are purchasing new appliances, more efficient and more resilient. So ways that we can support those applications of you'll notice that a lot of them are electrification. And I'll get into that in more detail later, but we see electrification as a major way to protect these vulnerable populations from price instability of energy, because electricity can come from wind, it can come from solar, it can come from various portfolio of various sources within the grid. It can also come from natural gas or any other generation facilities that we have available to us. So that's one huge opportunity we see that also overlaps with climate action as we increase the renewable portfolio within our grid. So the strategies that we've identified to really encourage that electrification and protecting vulnerable populations from price instability of energy include public education, rebates, and rebates can, we've seen a couple different utilities now offering rebates at a different level for different income levels. So lower income levels would qualify for greater rebate amounts to help adjust and help make the new electrified technologies more accessible to even lower income levels. We also like to try to connect concern with action. So we have, there tends to be a connection between income level and stability and concern or ability to access climate action, concern for climate change and ability to act on it. So connecting those two pieces of our population, we see as having a lot of really positive implications for our community. And that could look like when people come to us with concern about climate change, having a ready list of all of the ways that people can get involved with these different programs, volunteering for weatherization assistance programs, or setting up neighborhood action projects that address some of these issues, things like that. We also like to connect our residents directly with the resources that they need to make these changes in their lives. So that could be car dealerships when it comes to electric vehicles. That could be contractors for geothermal heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, induction stoves, weatherization, things like that. And we also are looking for ways that the utility or the city as a whole, other departments within the city, can take ownership of these facilities and help accelerate the transition to these electrified facilities and more efficient facilities that can be transitioned into a low carbon future. So I'll share some of those specific examples. The other section that I wanted to touch on is the affordable low carbon electricity. So again, we see this massive chasm between the folks in our community who are very concerned about climate change and have a lot of access to climate action strategies, like installing solar panels on their own home or installing their own geothermal system. A lot of those pieces are much more expensive than the alternatives, like a natural gas furnace. So that's a place where we see an opportunity for the utility to bring the whole community together behind some of these climate action and climate adaptation strategies. So instead of instead of necessarily encouraging those who can afford solar panels on their rooftop to install them, let's install utility scale renewables so that it's equally accessible to the whole community, instead of exacerbating that chasm between those who can afford those kinds of technologies and those who can't. And the utility has more buying power in that way. We have the economy of scale, and we have the connections between all of these different grid resources to get more impact out of those distributed energy resources. So instead of just installing solar panels wherever there are good rooftops for it or wherever people can afford it, We can look at the operation of the grid as a whole. We can even look at it as a microgrid, and make sure that those resources are interacting with each other in a way that benefits the whole community, and make sure that the more vulnerable communities within our city are also receiving those advantages of those improvements to our grid. So like I said, electrification is one of the pieces that we think is a great opportunity to really advance at this nexus, this connection point between climate action, climate vulnerability, and resilience of our grid. And that's largely because electricity can come from many different fuel sources. Electricity can come from wind and solar and natural gas and nuclear, and coal as well. So having lots of different options and agility within markets to provide electricity to all of these electrified appliances protects our community from some of the instability of prices that we see, particularly in gasoline, which would be an alternative to electric vehicles, and natural gas for heating. One of the specific applications of this that I wanted to share with you is that we recently finished installation of geothermal wells at the Baker subdivision here in Ames, Iowa. So at this subdivision, it was actually funded by the Community Development Block Grant, and we incorporated geothermal wells in each of these lots. So each of these 26 lots has 2 geothermal wells. There are not currently any houses built on this division. We just finished the public improvements this year. But when houses are built on this site, they will be able to connect to the most expensive part of the geothermal system for free. So there's no upfront cost to the homeowners. 51%, at least 51% of this subdivision will be low and middle income homeowners. So this is giving those people access to geothermal, geothermal heating and cooling, and electric heating particularly is the piece we see a lot of value in, with no upfront incremental cost. Wyandotte Municipal Utility has also done this in Michigan. And they've been doing it for much longer, but their system is set up a little bit different, where they will install these wells for anybody who requests it as a retrofit to their home. So the big difference here being new construction opportunity versus retrofits. This is a public education event that we held over the summer. So these are brand new DC fast chargers for electric vehicles that were installed this year. And this is one of the ways that we've tried to incorporate the whole community in this advancement of technology and infrastructure for electric vehicles. And at these events, electric vehicles tend to be more accessible to higher income levels. So we try to encourage folks to think about other ways that they can participate in this, buying used electric vehicles. Typically, rebates are only, you're only eligible for the rebate on a new vehicle. So we're looking for ways to also support the purchase of used vehicles, because those are the vehicles that some of our more vulnerable populations would have access to. We also try to connect these residents to, again, like I mentioned, the resources that they would need to make this change in their lives. And again, these advancements also have impacts in load shaping and grid resilience and decarbonization of our grid, as well as outage services. So we find this very urgent because a lot of the facilities and appliances that we're investing in right now are powered by fossil fuels. And so into the future, those appliances and facilities will be emitting more and more carbon emissions. So we're looking at trying to make all of these advancements accessible to as many parts of our community as possible through support for particularly lower income levels. so that we can start that transition now. And then the other piece of this vulnerability that we see is not in the new normal that's created by climate change, but in these catastrophes and these disasters. We recently had to deal with this firsthand after the derecho storm of 2020. So we find it very important to reduce the frequency of outages, reduce the duration of outages, and provide support services during those outages. And the way that we provide those services are absolutely impacted by an understanding of our vulnerable populations and how to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And I'm a little bit short on time, so I'm going to run through the next examples quickly. Energy storage and microgrids. We found that co-optimization of energy system dispatching dramatically increases the performance metrics and revenue implications, therefore the payback of these energy storage systems. So the implication of that is that as we increase the resilience of our grid as a whole, we're making sure that we're bringing the whole community along with us. So the role of a municipal electric utility in this area is making sure that all areas of the community income levels are supported equally and have the access to these improvements that they need. As we see more climate changes in our community, again, these technologies that protect some folks from climate change, like rooftop solar and batteries that people can install in their own homes and have outage power in an outage situation. Those aren't accessible to everybody. So doing it at a utility level, at the municipal level, is a way that we can bring everybody to a fair footing. We've also seen that combining different systems has a lot of impact on the survivability of an outage. So this is a study where they took 3 different facilities. These are all municipal facilities or public services that had backup power available to them, but they were still seeing a survivability rate of as low as 41% in a 7-day outage. So a lot of these pieces of the community were running out of backup power, and they weren't able to provide services to the community in those outage situations. But creating a microgrid out of them, pooling all of those resources, with just the addition of a little bit of solar and a little bit of storage, they were able to bring the survivability of all 3 of those facilities to 100% for a 7-day outage. So all of those facilities were able to support the community in an outage for up to 7 days. And that's, again, the role of a municipal utility or a municipality in having that ability to bring together different facilities and pool those resources and dispatch them in an intelligent way to support the community through outages and disasters. And again, we're looking for lots of ways to collaborate and make sure we get the most impact out of our projects, like combining solar and agriculture, or solar and habitat restoration for pollinators, stormwater management, public awareness and education. So all of these projects, we're looking for ways to incorporate the decarbonization, resilience of the grid, and helping to support vulnerable areas of the community all in one. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you for participating, and we're looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Kayley and Aaron. Fantastic presentations, extremely informative, both of them. There is a question. Does public education happening at K-12 level now? So is climate vulnerability being talked at? If you guys know about this being discussed in K through 12 education?
I'll let you start on that one, Aaron.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I knew. I don't have an answer for K-12 level. We certainly do try to get to introduce the concept with freshmen here at IU in our sort of intro U.S. policy and administration class. So the folks that are just a little bit out of high school are getting some exposure to the concepts, but I don't know about K through 12.
Yeah, certainly my experience has been that if you happen to visit or work with a AP environmental sciences class, yes, they'll discuss that. But beyond that, I agree. I don't think it is covered. Now, I have a couple questions, if you don't mind me leaving a few, and then people who are participating, please drop in your questions in the chat. Kayley, beyond, of course, wanting to your recommendations on an induction stove, which maybe I'll do that offline. Is Ames in a unique situation? Your relationship with electrical municipal corporation sounds a little bit different than a lot of cities that I know, and in the ability of controlling prices and achieving equity across the landscape. Is it unique, or is it more common than I might imagine?
Yes, I would say that it is unique compared to other municipalities. I would say it's very common amongst municipally owned utilities, though. I think this is an area where having public power really makes a big difference in the way that we can support our community in normal conditions, in the new normal conditions, and in natural disasters.
Great, thank you. And to you, Aaron, you mentioned this disconnect between the investments, if I think I got this right, the support for CDCs, these community development corporations, and their vulnerability, basically. So they're misaligned. How might, and then you showed some really great detailed maps, for example, of Indianapolis, which has a number of CDCs that span a whole range of the vulnerabilities that you lay out. How might a CDC best position itself to use some of that vulnerability information to pursue some of this new funding that might be coming down the pipeline, or any funding that enhances their resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that finding, I probably breezed through it too quickly, but it was very surprising because we expected that cities that had higher levels of social vulnerability, whether it was more spread throughout the city or even more concentrated in specific pockets, would engage in more support for those kinds of organizations because they fill in the gap. They help provide services to target vulnerable populations, and that's sort of what their calling was to help do when CDCs were created in the 1960s. And so it was surprising to find that. So we don't know if that is because, and then again, we're talking about a historical period here. The study was from 1999 through 2014. We don't know if that is because of during this period, there's just a lack of voice in communities to tapping into city resources, or if it's an out of sight, out of mind kind of phenomenon where cities are focusing their economic development activities on greenfield development and not so much on redevelopment. Maybe there's kind of a substitution that was happening there. But I think the good news is that during that time period, tools like the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, those things were not as commonly known or available. And so it was very easy for economic development strategies on the part of cities to be developed without a roadmap of where the need, was the most concentrated. So I think the message for community organizations as well as cities is partner up. It is mobilize, build, if you haven't already, build those relationships between the organizations that operate in these communities and are trusted partners there, and the cities, which are going to become conduits here for resources through the infrastructure bill and also potentially the Build Back Better plan if that ends up materializing. But there's going to be just a flood of activity on the part of states and local governments, as well as the federal agencies that have to implement these funding streams over the next 6 months to a year to try to get these dollars flowing. And the more cities can develop partnerships, it's like anybody who writes grants, build a partnership of grant seeking organizations, you're more likely to make a convincing case for these dollars.
Yeah, great, thank you. Kayley, for you, there's cities, for example, Indianapolis, their municipal electrical supply system corporation, Indianapolis Power and Light, they provide something called a green power plan. So you can opt in for a little additional cost a month, maybe 1% or 2% of your bill. And they have to buy, basically offset your use with renewables, right? It's green power plan. But then you also introduced home-based or even smaller scale, these microgrid concepts for both energy production and storage as a vulnerability mitigator, as it were. what is better? Like if I'm sitting here in Indianapolis, I'm 100% green power option, but I don't have rooftop solar. So should we basically give all of this to the like the electrical production facilities? Should we say, okay, you guys are in charge of going all renewable, and then you cite your resources here locally to make that happen?
I think it needs to be, I think the solution needs to be both and. That it's great for those who are interested in it, who can afford it, to install their own renewable generation facilities. And it's great for the utility to offer programs like the green power purchase. That's just a little bit easier way for you to do the same thing, but again, it's an increased expense. But most of the utilities are heading toward a drastic greenhouse gas reduction goal in 2030, and a lot of them are pushing for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So if we're to achieve that, that has to be done on a community level, right? So when you're purchasing these green rates, are you just offsetting your electric purchase, or are you investing in new renewable generation facilities for the entire community? So I think it's important for utilities to offer those options for people who want to help fund this transition. But after the transition is complete, there shouldn't be any green rates, because they should all be green, right? If we're really going to achieve these 2050 net zero goals. So I think I think those things can all exist, and they all are helpful in the transition, but they should be phased out kind of by definition by the time we reach these 2030, 2050 goals. So I do think it needs to be both, and that will change as we start to achieve that transition.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So back to you, Aaron. We were talking about CDCs just then, and I'm most familiar with the ones I work with in Indianapolis, and there's one particular on the east side that hosts the Bonner Center, where there's a federal designation for CDCs that they get earn points toward federal grant applications in certain categories. I forgot what the program is called, but is that an example of these federal programs that will help these CDCs that need the most help, basically?
I mean, it could be. I think that there are different metrics that HUD, for example, will use to evaluate CDCs, in which CDCs are more competitive or more need for resources. I think that the overriding sort of metric or I guess strategy that we would like to see, from a city perspective or local government perspective, is more collaboration and or organizational sort of capacity building. What I mean by that is that on the east side, for example, there are not to get too indie focused here, but there's an area on the east side that's been designated as a resilience hub that Indianapolis, the city, and a number of other partners have all tried to focus on and bring their own unique skill sets to play in a given geographic area there on the Near East Side. And so it's to the point now where the sustainability office in Indianapolis doesn't really, is trying to just step back and get out of the way, because there were so many different partners, whether it's other units of the city government or other community development groups there that are all providing their own sort of niche services to try to make a geographic area more resilient. I think that is a model, a resilience hub. It's a model that's been tried in several other cities. I think that is something that's going to be extremely competitive and attractive for these dollars that are coming down, again, through multiple pipelines. And it's likely that there will be overlapping sort of grant applications, right, or even formula delivered funds that are going to be utilized within the same geographic space. So I guess kind of the unit of analysis here probably should be the geographic space, right? And then all of the different actors that could potentially bring resources to bear there.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. And Kayley, a longer question, but could you address that question in the chat?
Sure. So the question is about the housing stock in Ames, and whether we can whether we can kind of attack this electrification project at the same time as other critical health and safety issues, or if those have to be different projects and then if they are different, how do you prioritize them, is how I'm reading the question. So do we see low and moderate income folks taking advantage of increased rebates for electric and efficient appliances? It's a great question. And that's what we spend a lot of our time talking about. And that's what we're looking at, ways to make sure that that does happen, because I don't think it has in the past. There are a couple of examples of where I think that it absolutely can and that it should, and it just requires a little bit more public education, like electric heat pump water heaters. That's one of the applications that really doesn't have a downside. As long as we provide a rebate to bring the incremental costs down to zero, so they're the same upfront cost as a natural gas or electric resistance heater, which we've done, and we've been able to provide that, then the savings over time, there's no upfront incremental costs, and there's a huge amount of savings compared to either natural gas or electric resistance water heating. So we implemented that rebate a little over a year ago, and we did hope to see, especially in this application, a lot of lower income levels taking advantage of the rebate, and they haven't. So it took us a while to figure out why, but I think that it's just a transition. It's really the contractors that they don't like working with the technology because they don't know how it works. They don't know how to fix it. So it's just so then we've reached out to, now we're in the process of reaching out to those contractors and implementing SPIFs, where when we provide the rebate to the homeowner, we would also provide a small rebate to the contractor for leading that homeowner to the more efficient option and incentivize them to get to know this new opportunity. That's a little bit what the geothermal at Baker subdivision is as well, because the city developed the subdivision, but we're not building the houses. We're not developing each of the individual houses. So by installing the infrastructure and owning the most expensive part of the infrastructure as a municipal utility, we're forcing all of those contractors to touch geothermal technology, right? And kind of forcing them to get familiar with it, and showcasing for the rest of the community what this technology can do. It's not so scary. Look, it works. You know, people can save money on their heating bills, even on their cooling bills. It's far more efficient than air conditioners. So yeah, I think that the answer to that question is no. Low and moderate income folks aren't taking advantage of those rebates nearly as much as we'd hope they would. And so the next step in this journey is figuring out why, and it's a little bit different for each technology. But I do think that's a very important thing to look at. Another application would be, you know, are we providing rebates just for new EVs? Because there's a whole subsection of the population that's never going to buy a new car, myself included. So, you know, what are we doing to support people in the purchases that they can access? And are we really providing enough to get that incremental cost close to zero?
Great. Yeah, and one thing that really resonated with your presentation as well is when you buy infrastructure, even if you're a homeowner and buying infrastructure, you're locking in for quite a long time, and you better be thinking carefully about that decision. So thank you both. Phenomenal presentations, both. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve to walk us out.
Thank you, everybody, for attending today's presentation, and thank you to our speakers for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and launch a brief poll here, just for help us gather some feedback about our webinar series. So if you could go ahead and answer those questions before you hop off, we would greatly appreciate that. And I'm going to go ahead and end the call in just a couple minutes here.